There's a story I heard of an archaeologist who was digging in the Negev. The Negev is the southern desert in Israel. He came upon a casket containing a mummy. And after examining it, he called the curator of a prestigious natural history museum and wanted to tell him of his find. He says, on the phone, he says, I've just discovered a 3,000-year-old mummy, and it's a man who died of heart failure. Well, that's a pretty big claim for in the field. The curator said, well, bring him in, we'll check it out, we'll see what's what. So they bring him in and they do the whole MRI, imaging scans and things like that. And the amazed curator, after a week, calls the archaeologist back and he goes, well, you were right about the mummy. It was the age that you talked about, and he actually did die of heart failure. How in the world could you have known that? And the archaeologist replied, well, it was easy. There was just a piece of paper on his hand that said 10,000 shekels on Goliath to win. So, archaeology can tell us things about life in past times. And that's what we hope to glean from it. Now, why do we worry about the Bible in archaeology? Well, it's an interesting subject, first of all. I think that's important. Primarily, we talk about the Bible in archaeology, at least in an apologetics context, because the Bible frequently comes into question as to its truth value. The Bible is one of the oldest written religious works in the world. Yet it does something that's fairly unique in ancient religious writing. It puts the events it reports within a real historical context. It claims to be reporting history as much as talking about specific movements of God. Whereas the Bhagavad Gita will have, some of the manifestations of Vishnu or Krishna or one of these guys. They'll say that he took on the form of X and battled this guy for Y. There's no real definitive kind of area or timeline that you can pinpoint that to. The Bible is different. Both Old and New Testament make specific claims to specific periods in time. Now, that's not always easy to discern what those periods of time are, because a lot of the way the Old Testament works is self-referential or interreferential, and I'll get to that down the road a bit. But we would at least understand the Bible if it is the text that it purports to be, that it would be reliable. New Testament fragments and manuscripts found show that the text of the New Testament we rely upon are actually historically accurate. The people, places, and names, dates that they talk about fit the other historical chronology that we know. And there's not been, it's not mythological like in the eons of time past or something like that. Luke is actually called a historian of the first order by William F. Albright, who's one of the pioneers in our 20th century archaeology. The New Testament claims to be written by eyewitnesses. Luke says, I give unto you that which I first received. That's Paul that says that. Luke says, "O Theophilus, I made a attempt for a careful account to talk to the eyewitnesses and put down in an orderly manner that which I had heard," is what Luke tells us. And then we have this whole Dead Sea Scrolls issue that really substantiated much of the Old Testament by pushing back the earliest copies we have of the Old Testament books by well over a millennia, which is exciting. So the fact that the Bible claims to be from God and it claims to talk about real people doing real things, we want to know if that's true, if that's reliable. That's one reason why we care about this. We want to know if it's accurate. Is it talking about things as they really happened, or maybe it's talking about real people but inventing stories of what they did? That's possible too. The biggest piece for me, though, is if you look at God's interaction with people, especially in the Old Testament, God continually points to what he's done in the past and then says, trust me in the future. Now, for a Christian who's maybe not one to doubt the existence of God, or even to doubt, say, some of the aspects of the Bible, this is still very, very important. We look at archaeology not because our faith is in jeopardy, but because we can have confidence in our God and what he's going to do in the future from his faithfulness in the past. If you look at the Psalms, you can see God over and over say, wasn't I the one that pulled you out of Egypt? Did I not, And he recounts these stories, and he says, that's why you should trust me. See, we don't believe, Christianity is not a blind faith. It is a faith based on evidence, and that evidence is historical. So anytime we get a historical evidence that we're talking about, we need to look to a historical approach, and that's where archaeology comes in. But even then, archaeology helps us out in other ways as students of the Bible. First of all, it can help us interpret events with more clarity than we've had in the past. It gives us a little bit of insight into things that we don't otherwise know. Job chapter 18, verse 15 reads, "His confidence shall be rooted out of his tabernacle, and it shall bring him to the King of terrors. It shall dwell in his tabernacle because it is none of his. Brimstone shall be scattered upon his habitation. His roots shall be dried up beneath, and above his branch shall be cut off." Okay, that's about as clear as mud to me. I don't know about you guys, but it's really hard to figure out what the heck is he saying. It really does become difficult until Mitchell Dahoud studied the language, and he looked at the language not of, I'm blanking on it, not of Hebrew, but of Ugarit, which is Ur, the language of the ancient city of Ur and that surrounding area, right? That's where Abraham was supposed to have come from. And Job, they think, is somewhere near a contemporary of Abraham. So what this scholar did was he started looking at that language in that time as opposed to looking at the Hebrew, which would be a later development. And then he finds that the phrase, "that which is one of his," should more properly be associated with the root meaning to burn. So he retranslates verse 15 to read, "Fire is set in his tents, indeed sulfur is strewn on his dwellings." Now, that not only makes more sense, just the way it reads, it's a little bit more natural, but it also shows that standard kind of Semitic repetition that you see in a lot of Hebrew Psalms where they say the same thing twice, and the second time is for emphasis. So, archaeology helps us to understand the text. Archaeology helps us to understand customs and practices more appropriately. How many of you have ever gotten a question on why an all-good God would allow slavery to exist? You ever heard that one? That's very popular nowadays with certain atheists. Well, when we start looking at the practice of slavery in the Old Testament, we can find out some things. Raymond Westhook, in his book, it's the history of the ancient Near East, looked at a neighboring nation called the Hittites. And here's what he wrote when he started talking about slavery. He says, Gutterbach, which is another scholar, refers to slaves in the strict sense, quote unquote, apparently referring to chattel slaves such as those of classical antiquity. Chattel slaves would be slaves like you would see in the Old South, slaves that people owned. But he basically goes on to say that kind of slavery wasn't practiced in the mid-Near East. The Hittites, the Israelites, folks like that, that wasn't the kind of slavery that they were involved with. He said this characterization may have been valid for house slaves whose master could treat him as he wished when they were at fault. But it is less suitable when they were capable of owning property and could pay betrothal money or fines. So imagine a slave that could pay his own fine, he could own his own property. Are we really still talking about slave in the sense that we think about it? He goes, the meaning servant seems to be more appropriate, or perhaps a designation of semi-free person as opposed to a full chattel slave. It comprises every person who is subject to orders or dependent upon another, but nonetheless has a certain independence within his own sphere of activity. So when we start looking at how slaves actually lived in those days, and we find out, wow, slaves could own land, and they could draw a salary, and they could, be responsible for paying off fines and paying off things. So Israelite slaves are not necessarily the same category as, say, African American slaves in the antebellum South. They're two different things. It's kind of like, what we had serfdom or sharecropping, that kind of thing. There's a difference there.